All right, and we are live. Michael Uslan, how are you doing?
Much better. I'm doing great, Eric. Thank you.
All right, I'm actually wearing the same shirt. We're kind of doing a bit of a do-over. Unusual thing happened last time we were doing a show, and you had something go on with your family.
Yeah, it was a personal emergency situation that
Right.
I had to flee immediately to tend to. So I thank you for your indulgence and eager to talk Batman and comic books and movies with you and all the folks who are listening in.
Absolutely. And by the way, I was just telling you in private, never apologize about a family emergency because everybody else is really irrelevant. They are who back us up. They're the ones who keep us together. In the end, why do we do anything we do except for family?
Absolutely true. No one knows that better than Batman. He had to learn that the hard way. Superman had a Superman family easy enough. With Batman, it's taken a little bit of effort to put one together.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's interesting. A lot of this I know you've already discussed before, things like that, but who was it you liked before Batman? I know you discovered Batman, I think at 7 or 8, but you
Yeah,
had favorites prior to that.
I did. Number one, first and foremost, was Superman. I am someone who grew up in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. And when I was a little kid, Superman was on TV. So Superman was family friendly. I knew Superman, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Clark Kent, Perry White very, very well. Felt very comfortable and enthralled reading Superman comics. And, my mom always said, I learned to read from comic books before I was 4 years old. And, the earliest ones I remember were a lot of the Harvey comics, Casper, one called Little Max that was a favorite of mine. And by the way, Richie Rich, of course, until much later in life, I had the epiphany that this was Donald Trump in short pants. So I stopped reading Richie Rich.
Oh, no, that's not fair.
I graduated onto Archie and used to read Classics Illustrated, Dell Comics, Disney Comics, Looney Tunes, Walter Lantz, you name it, I collected it and I read it.
And you did collect it, I think, 30,000 issues, not only Batman, but just about every comic book out there at one time, correct?
Yeah, 30,000 by the time I graduated high school. Over the years, if you were to tally up probably all the comic books that I had bought, we're probably well over 100,000. But twice in my life, I was forced to sell off 20,000 comics at a time. I sold them initially to pay for the engagement ring for my wife, for our wedding rings, and to take her on a 2-week honeymoon to Europe. So that was 20,000 comic books got me that.
Wow.
But right now, I have donated some 45,000 comic books from my collection to Indiana University's Lilly Library, which is its rare book library. And I have kept several thousand. I promised my son David I would. So he will still have every first issue of every Marvel comic and every first appearance and first issue of every DC Silver Age and Bronze Age. So that is my gift to my family.
Okay, and this is an off-the-wall question for you because you grew up in the Silver Age. It sounds like, really, kind of right in the heart of it. Everything seems to be backward with the comics, with the golden, then silver, then bronze. It's almost like the Olympic medals, where the older it is, the higher the level. Is this a value proposition, or why are they denoted in such a manner?
Well, it started out, I was a very, very early member of comic book fandom as it was getting organized, and would subscribe to the original fanzines, things like the Rocket Blast Comic Collector, Alter Ego, On the Drawing Board, which was also called the Comic Reader from time to time, Batmania. And as we were organizing fandom, it was really led by two individuals. Number one was Dr. Jerry Bales, who was a college professor at Wayne State University. He's the guy who gave fandom and comic books its credibility. The fact that a college professor was doing this that really helped pierce the Frederick Wortham seduction of the innocent age of comic books as the Satan's evil craft on the planet Earth. Roy Thomas, the famous Roy Thomas from Marvel and DC Comics and Charlton Comics, was also, I would say, second in command in the founding of comic book fandom as we really knew it. And it was really Jerry Bales who first called the comic book era of the 38 through the 40s into the early 50s the first heroic age of comics, because that's when superheroes took over. And he referred to what we now call the Silver Age of comics, initially was called the second heroic age of comics. And everyone felt that was really bulky and not easy to spit out quickly. So we talk about 38 through the 40s into the early 50s as really a golden age, the way golden age is generically used. You could say that the 1920s and 30s was the golden age of baseball, for example, or the 50s and 60s was the golden age of rock and roll. So it was always used in that context, not to connote value.
Okay.
And then in an issue of Justice League of America, very few people will know this, the cover was Metamorpho Says No. He rejected, for the first time, any superhero rejected a membership in the Justice League. In that innocuous little comic book, on its letter page, is a letter from a kid in Brooklyn. No, not in Brooklyn. He was from Connecticut. And it said, wow, these stories you're churning out where we see these 1940s DC comic book heroes teamed up with our heroes today. These are all just amazing. The art is great on all your stories. The writing is great. If the 1940s was the golden age of comics, this truly would be the silver. And that was where Silver Age came from. It really it was precipitated by that letter, and it kind of caught on. And so it only became natural after a while. The hot debate was, when did the Silver Age actually end? And when did the, obviously, next one had to be Bronze. When did the Bronze Age begin? A lot of us who are comic book historians, I think, really think 1970 is the year for that.
Okay, so to finish this out, I mean, what's next? Or are comic books themselves dying out? I've heard different things.
No, they're definitely not dying out. Every generation they've been talking about comics dying out. They were going to die out because World War II was over and the servicemen were no longer reading them, and they were the second most predominant audience for comic books in the world. Then comic books were going to die in the 50s due to Dr. Wortham and seduction of the innocent. And then they were going to die by the 60s because of the advent and growth of television that was taking kids away from spending their 10 or 12 cents on comic books. And it's always been something that was going to be the death knell of comic books. But somehow, in one form or another, they've persevered. And I think they will continue to do so. How they will be distributed, how they will be delivered, whether electronically or in print or in both, or projected on the moon every night for us to look up and read, I don't have a clue. But we're not supposed to have a clue. But it is a vibrant storytelling method that has been around since ancient civilizations. It came out of an oral tradition. I contend that our superheroes are indeed our modern day mythology, and that this is our contemporary folklore. So I think they will always be around. We need stories that talk of great heroes sacrificing all to battle the demons and dragons of the day. And I think we will always have that in some form or another. With the advent of graphic novels, comic books began to mature. We have now more and more sophisticated graphic storytelling, and people have to understand, and a lot of people don't, that comic books and superheroes are not synonymous. If you look back in the history of comics, or you open yourselves up to comics and graphic novels, you will find that any kind of book you would find in a Barnes and Noble store, you can find in the pages of comic books, whether it's war, humor, Western, science fiction, horror, romance, whatever it might be, whatever the genre might be, you can find. And students of cinema often don't realize that many great movies like The 300, Road to Perdition, American Splendor, A History of Violence, were all based on comics or graphic novels. So it is still a vibrant source for great storytelling.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jessica Abel. She
Not.
she did the comic book for This American Life of all things, NPR person into it. And I had an interview with her, and she was talking about how she didn't like the term graphic novel. And I thought that was an unusual thing because she is a comic book artist, and she literally drew Ira Glass, his career, and drew a illustrated guide to radio. It was very famous. It went around everywhere. But she was saying that graphic novels is something she avoids because of the term graphic, that she worries that it has a connotation of adult material. And I don't know if you'd ever heard anything before like that. It was just an interesting observation.
I never heard anything like that before. I can understand what she is alluding to, but I think that audiences today, generally speaking only, are sophisticated enough to, realize what it is. I think that the popular consensus is that Will Eisner coined the term in the 70s. And the first graphic novel that a lot of people accept as the first graphic novel is his great piece of work, A Contract with God. You can make arguments that there were earlier things that really were graphic novels as well. But that's the whole history of comics. You can debate an awful lot of things in terms of the history and the evolution of comics and comic strips, actually. So yeah, I hear her point. I don't think we have to worry about it too much. It reminds me of what Stan Lee and Marty Goodman had to worry about over at Marvel when they were publishing a comic book called Amazing Adult Fantasy. And Stan told me he started to get inundated with letters and phone calls from irate parents and some newspapers like, oh my God, my 10-year-old came in with this adult comic book. And by Amazing Fantasy 15, when Spider-Man debuted, they had removed adult from the title for exactly the reason you're alluding to here. So there's precedent for that. But it doesn't bother me in particular.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Actually, that brings to a story of yours that I love. I know you've told it a bunch before, but hopefully you can cue it up again. You used the whole idea of controversy, communism, comic books in order to sell a class. Do you want to tell that tale?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be happy to tell that. So you want me to go back and tell the story of how I taught the world's first college accredited course on comic books? Okay. So folks, what you have to understand about me is if you are a comic book fanboy or fangirl, I'm one of you. I mean, it is in my blood. That's who I am. As I mentioned, I was an early member of comic book fandom, subscriber to the fanzines. I started writing for the fanzines when I was 13 years old. And luckily, I grew up in New Jersey, an hour outside of New York City. So my dad and my mom often gave up their Sundays to drive me to the homes of comic book creators, artists, writers, creators, because back then, most of the comic book industry was based in New York City, and most of the creators lived in either New Jersey or Long Island or Manhattan. So I would go and do interviews with them, and that's how I met so many of the original creators of these things.
And they're very middle class too, right? I mean, they weren't exactly driving the most expensive cars in the world. They're just
they were
regular workers.
Most of them were struggling. Some of the editors were doing okay. Stan and Jack were doing okay. Mort Weisinger was doing okay, but a lot of them were struggling. They were struggling all the time. And that was the nature of the business. Right? Artists were not getting back their original art to sell. They were getting a page rate. They didn't have an ownership position in any of these things. So it was a different time. You could count on one hand the number of people in the comic book industry who were creators that made out pretty well. But that's about it for back then in that era. So I grew up with it. I was at the world's first comic book convention. About 200 of us showed up at the first Comic-Con. But that was my life. So I was always looking for an opportunity to get my foot in the door somewhere to get into the world of comics and to use that and maybe build a career out of it. And my first opportunity to do that came when I was in college at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. Now, I'm a blue-collar kid from New Jersey. My father was a stonemason. My mom was a bookkeeper. We didn't come from money. I'm in Indiana. It was the early 1970s. As I always say, a time of great experimentation on college campuses, and I won't say anything more about that, except to acknowledge that the university realized that was true. And in response to the times, they started an experimental curriculum department. And the idea was, if you had a concept for a course that had never been taught before, if you had the backing of one of the departments of arts and sciences, you could then appear before a panel of deans and professors and pitch your course. If the dean accepted it, you could then teach it on campus for up to 6 hours of credit. 3 hours of credit. And it didn't matter that I was an undergrad. Anybody could do it. So I saw that as an opportunity, and I wrote up a syllabus. And the syllabus was an academic approach to comic books. Comic books as art. My contention was they're an indigenous American art form, as true to this country as jazz. Comic books as literature, the psychological impact of comic books on its audience, the fact that sociologically, comic books are a mirror of our society. They are a reflector of America and American values. Published every Wednesday since the mid-1930s, comic books have reflected our politics, our fads, our slang, our biases, our prejudices, and you can really, really take the temperature of America just by reading comic books over the decades. The last thing was that comic book superheroes are indeed our contemporary mythology. My theory that I posed to my folklore professor was that the ancient gods of Greece and Rome and Egypt all still exist, except today they wear spandex and capes. So he said to me, you're right about that. He says, whether it's Beowulf or Ulysses or Superman or Batman or Spider-Man, it is the same basic plots and motifs. Thor is the greatest example of all. And how different is Flash from Mercury or Hermes? How different is Aquaman from Poseidon or Neptune? So he said, I will back you. And the last thing he said to me was, he goes, remember, whether we call them King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table or the Avengers or the Justice League, they are the same stories of the same heroes. So I went and I pitched to the dean and the professors. And the dean, these were people who were of the Frederick Wortham seduction of the innocent adult generation. They looked down their noses at comic books, at comic book creators. They had no respect for them whatsoever. They were either dismissive about them or worried that they might be harmful to kids. Mm-hmm. So I go into pitch, and as I walked into the room, the dean looks at me and says, so you're the fellow who wants to teach a course on funny books at my university? And that's when I knew I was facing an uphill climb. I started my pitch, and the dean let me speak for 2 minutes and then cut me off. He said, Mr. Uslan, stop. He goes, come on. Comic books is art, is mythology. Give me a break. He said, I read comic books when I was a little child. I read every issue of Superman I could when I was a boy. But all these comic books are cheap entertainment for little children, nothing more, nothing less, and I reject your theory. And then, Eric, it was a life-changing moment for me because I figured I had nothing to lose. So I decided to stand my ground. And I said, Dean, may I ask you 2 questions? He said, ask me anything you want. I said, are you familiar with the story of Moses? And he said, yeah, so. I said, so Dean, very, very briefly, would you just summarize for me the story of Moses? And he said, I don't know what game you're playing here, but I'll play it with you. The Hebrew people were being persecuted. Their firstborn were being slain. A Hebrew couple placed their infant son in a little wicker basket, send him down the River Nile, where he's discovered by an Egyptian family who raised him as their own son. When he grew up and learned of his true heritage, he became a great hero to the Hebrew people. I said, great, thank you. That was great, Dean. I said, you mentioned before when you were a kid, you read Superman. By any chance, do you remember the origin of Superman? He said, of course, the planet Krypton was about to blow up. A scientist and his wife placed their infant son in a little rocket ship and sent him to Earth. There he's discovered by the Kents, who raised him as their own son. When he grows up, and then he stops, stares at me for an eternity, and says, your course is accredited. And that was it. I at that moment became the world's first ever college professor of comic books. So I'm a junior, and I couldn't believe I pulled it off. So I go back to my place off campus. I call my mom in New Jersey, and she's very happy for me, but then she lets me have it. She says, Michael, you can have the greatest ideas in the world. You can have the greatest creative wares in the world. But if you don't market them, if you don't market yourself, no one will ever know them. I said, Ma, I just turned 20. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana. I have no money. How am I supposed to do that? And she said, well, you're a smart boy. You'll figure it out. So faced with nowhere to turn and nothing to lose, once again, I picked up the telephone and called the United Press International and asked to speak to a reporter. This poor guy gets on the phone, and I started to scream at him. I said, what's wrong with you? You're not doing your job. You're supposed to be the watchdogs of our society. And he said to me, calm down. What are you talking about? I go, what am I talking about? Are you kidding me? I just heard there's a course on comic books being taught at Indiana University. Are you telling me as a taxpayer in the state, they're teaching our children comic books? This must be some communist plot to subvert the youth of America. And I slammed down the phone. Well, it took this guy 3 days of canoodling to find out that there really was this course and that I was the professor. And he showed up at my doorstep, him and a photographer. This article went out, a third of a page long, picked up by virtually every newspaper in North America and a bunch in Europe. And my phone started ringing off the hook. I had CBS Evening News, the NBC Nightly News came down to film my class. I was invited on radio and TV talk shows. I had reporters in every class. And a few weeks go by, and I get two interesting phone calls on the same day. The first one was this very exuberant male voice that said, hi, is this Mike Uslan? Oh, yeah. He goes, hi, I'm Mike. This is Stan Lee from Marvel Comics in New York City. And that I always describe as my burning bush moment. I was talking to my God, and Stan said to me, Mike, he goes, I'm watching you on TV. I'm listening to you on the radio. What you're doing is great for the whole comic book industry. How can I help you? And it was at that moment that Stan went from becoming my idol to my mentor, ultimately to my friend and my creative associate. And I'm very proud to say that my son David and I were two of the producers of Stan's memorial at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, which was the ultimate Stan Lee style send-off. He would have loved every second of it. About a couple hours later, the phone rings, and it's another male voice, adult voice, and it's Mr. Uslan. My name is Saul Harrison. I'm vice president of DC Comics in New York. He said, we've been reading about you in magazines and in newspapers. He said, you're a very innovative young man, and we'd like to fly you to New York City and discuss ways we can work together. Geek dream come true. They offer me a job at DC. I will work there in the summers in New York. And while I go back to study at Indiana University, they will put me on a retainer. It was like incredible, absolutely incredible. So first week I'm on the job that summer. It's towards the end of the first week, and it's about 6 o'clock. And all of a sudden, down the editorial corridor from one of the offices, I hear yelling and screaming like somebody's being killed. So I run down there. It was Denny O'Neil, a dear friend, I think arguably one of the greatest writers of the Silver Age and Bronze Age of comics, a great editor as well. And I said, Denny, are you all right? He goes, no, I'm not all right. I go, what's the Matter? He said, Carmine Infantino, the publisher at the time, So Carmine had canceled our comic book, The Shadow, due to low sales. I said, so that's what you're upset about? He goes, no. He goes, he did that a while ago. Now the new sales figures came in on the last issue and it had a big spike. So he reinstated it on the schedule, which means that in order to meet the printing press, a full script has to be done by the end of the day tomorrow. I said, okay, why is that a problem? He goes, Michael, it's a problem because I don't have a full script. I don't have a shadow story. I don't even have an idea for a shadow story. I said, well, Denny, I have an idea for a shadow story. He said, you do? I didn't. But so what? I saw the door was open, just this crack. So just shoved my foot in. And Denny said, all right, come on in, sit down. Tell me what your story is. So I'm like making stuff up right on the spot. And my wife and I, my girlfriend at the time, and I had just gotten back from Niagara Falls. I said, well, back in the 40s and 30s, people were going over the falls in barrels and walking across in tightropes. Picture the Shadow battling a bad guy at night over Niagara Falls on a tightrope with the searchlights going. And then he said, that's a great visual. That's a great cover. But Michael, what's the story about? I said, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. The story is about smuggling. He says, and what are they smuggling? I said, well, they are smuggling drugs. And he said, so what's the creative take? There has to be something creative about it. So I said, well, Denny, I've been saving this for the end because it's the best part. You know, the wheels are turning and turning. And I go, they were going over the falls in barrels back then. False bottom in the barrels. They're putting the drugs in there. They go over the Canadian Falls side, wash up onto the American side. That's how they're getting all the drugs through. He says, now that's different. That's creative. Can you have a full script on my desk tomorrow at 6 p.m.? I said, no problem. He said, go do it. I'm now a writer for DC Comics. So I pull an all-nighter. I do wind up writing the whole damn thing and getting it in thanks to some secretaries. I was feeding them pages all day long. And 2 weeks later, I'm walking down that same editorial corridor. And who's coming toward me but Julie Schwartz, arguably the most important editor in the history of comics. For ye uninitiated, he is the guy who gave us the Justice League and the Silver Age Flash, Green Lantern, Atom, Hawkman, returned Batman to his dark roots in the 1970s with the able creative aid of Denny and Neil Adams, Irv Novick, and so many other great people. And Julie was kind of a gruff character until you got to know him. Then he was kind of a marshmallow, but he was gruff. So he saw me coming, the kid with the long hair. He goes, hey, kid. I go, yes, Julie. He goes, I read your Shadow script. I said, you did? He goes, yeah. It didn't stink. I go, oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And then he said, how'd you like to take a shot at writing Batman?
Oh,
Eric, I still get the chills today. This was the dream I had since I was 8 years old. And with my buddy and fellow DC Comics Woodchuck, Junior Woodchuck, Bob Rozakis, we wrote a 3-parter for Detective Comics. And it was life-changing. It was really life-changing to be able to do that. Wow. I mean, that was just one of the great moments. And so you can see in my story and my evolution, the through line is always Batman for some reason. Mm-hmm. It's certainly been a comic book central, but it's always been about knocking on doors and trying to get your foot in the door wherever you see an opening, not getting discouraged, not getting frustrated, and keep on persevering and trying to figure out a way to take this passion I had in my life since I was little that just burns through my veins and make it into my life's work.
And I want to back out I want to back into that. And I kind of wanted to see if I could draw a parallel path here. Like, did you always want to be a producer as a kid?
No.
Or what was your actual dream? Was it to just say, I want to bring heroes to life? Or was that a dream as a kid? What was your ultimate ambition?
No, my dream as a kid was to write Batman comics.
Oh,
I used to write and draw my own comics when I was a kid through about seventh grade. that was my fascination. That was it for me. And as I learned that I had a creative writing ability, thanks to my 7th and 8th grade English teachers who discovered this ability, who nurtured it, and who smashed me back and forth over the head until I could attempt to master the craft of writing and what that took and what that meant. I finally saw an opportunity where I could take this creative writing and this comic book thing and make it an adult career out of it. And it was only when I got into the business initially that I realized in the real fake world of Hollywood, writers are often people who give up their kids for adoption. Other people, other companies option your work or buy your work, and then they could do anything they want to it. They can call in 20 other writers. They could turn it from a comedy to a drama, from a drama to a comedy, or there was always the Western starring Ed Asner script that they ultimately turned into a space opera starring Charlize Theron. So that kind of sums it up. And I was told by my first mentor in Hollywood that if I wanted to be a writer and maintain any degree of control over what I was doing, I had to become a producer.
Okay, now
I made the decision to produce.
Okay, so and yeah, this is how I wanted to, kind of back in to get this path. Like, why Indiana? You're a New Jersey kid. You obviously have major family connections there. Everything else. Why did you go to school in Indiana? It seems like an odd choice.
Several reasons. Number one, let's call it 3 reasons. Number one, my older brother Paul went there, and I got to visit him and stay with him for several days on campus. I think it's the most beautiful campus in North America. Certainly, arguably, one of the most beautiful campuses in North America. And I just kind of fell in love with the place. Number 2, back in high school, they had this thing called Scholastic Magazine. I'm told it's still there. And every year they had a national creative writing contest. I won it in my senior year.
Oh.
And I was invited to New York City to meet with the judges. And I'm talking to them and they said, where have you been accepted at college? And I gave them the 5 places that I was accepted. And they told me, if you're interested in writing, whether it's journalism or creative writing, you want the Indiana University programs.
Okay.
So that was reason number 2. Reason number 3, the most important reason, saving for last, I found out if I went to Indiana, I didn't have to take math.
That's why they have the strongest writing program. You know that, right?
Yeah,
that is why their program is the strongest, is they figured out this is the shortcut. You want the best writers in America? Don't make them take math. They'll all come here.
That's it. That absolutely is it. I'm very comfortable with words and sentences, but numbers absolutely baffle me. So that sealed the deal. I'm told they have since filled the crack in their curriculum on that. You can't get away with that today. But that was really those are the 3 reasons that brought me to Indiana happily, because I wound up staying there for 7 years. I got 3 degrees there, my bachelor's in history. I stayed and got my master's in urban education simply because of work I was doing at DC Comics at the time. That's a whole story in and of itself. And then I stayed on for law school and got my JD there.
Okay. And now I knew you were a lawyer, and this is where it gets really interesting, because you mentioned about being a producer and being in Hollywood. I do another show called America's Untold Stories, and my partner is Mark Robert. He's worked with Oliver Stone, and he writes all the time. And we have war stories, and he has war stories like crazy. And reading your book just made me laugh, because there's some stories and parallels. I may bring them up. But he determined later in life, because he was a National Lampoon editor and things like that, that he wanted to be a screenwriter. He found his way in as a location scout.
Mm-hmm.
And his idea with that was, as a location scout, I can kind of hang out on the movie sets and I get to talk to everybody and anybody, because there's no specific spot for him, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
As a lawyer, you were going right into the production side, I'm guessing, and having to build relationships etc. Was that an intentional path for you? Like, I'm going to go in, get this legal, find the legal department and just kind of use it as a way in the door, kind of like you said at DC.
Not initially. Ultimately, yes, but not initially. Here's what happened to me. My senior year, now, everybody, I got to give you the context at the time. There was no such thing as computers. There was no internet. We had these big buildings called libraries, and we had these things. Let me see if I have
Microfiche and microfilm.
Yeah, let me see if I have one here. Yeah, I can hold you up. We had these things. These were called paper pads, and we had these things. They're called pens. And so every Friday, I would go to the library with my pad and pen, and I would get the issue of Weekly Variety that they would subscribe to. Variety was the newspaper Bible for the entertainment industry. I read it cover to cover and would write down the names of any executives at any movie or television or animation company. And I would write down their title. By the end of my senior year, I had 372 names that I could send my resumes to instead of just sending them to human resources or to whom it may concern. But
hold on, I don't want to interrupt because this is really interesting, but I see how people move around in Hollywood, like somebody who's an assistant this week. And you've talked about in your book how the person who's assistant this week is suddenly a showrunner in a year or two. Were you seeing that back then when you were taking all the notes in Variety? Like, oh, I know this name, and this person was at this studio doing this, and now they're over here doing that?
No, I was subjected to harsh reality, thrown into the deep end and told to swim kind of a thing. I'll jump ahead with you right now. So my first trip to Los Angeles, I was still in school. I was finishing up, and I arranged for 30 job interviews over a period of, I don't know how long I was out there. Maybe I was out there two weeks maximum. And I had two resumes that I wound up composing. One was about me in law school and everything to do with law, and the fact that I had won the yearly legal paper award for having written a 104-page paper on copyright infringement and unfair competition in the comic book industry. That was a new one on all of them. Never mentioned I taught a course in comic books, that I wrote comic books, and it had a little picture of me in a three-piece suit. Then I had a separate resume that had a picture of me in a Steven Spielberg, baseball style cap, that never mentioned I went to law school, and was just about all the creative stuff, creative writing awards and things that I had done.
That's brilliant. I mean, that's smart. I mean, you're way ahead of the game on that, because most people would pile on all this experience, but you literally are tailoring to fit a specific role that they might be seeking.
Yeah. Well, what I actually did was I sent two different resumes to the same companies. I would send my creative resume to 20th Century Fox production for a production development job. I'd send my legal resume to the general counsel or legal or business affairs of 20th Century Fox. So there's a story I tell in my new book, which Stanley always said, Michael, for God's sake, get in a plug whenever you can. It's called Batman's Batman. It is a memoir. It is the sequel memoir to my book, The Boy Who Loved Batman. It's now out on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, et cetera. And the audiobook version that I narrate is also out right now through.
I know, I've read it. I listened to it. Always, by the way, a hint, if you're ever doing podcasts and shows, always lead with the audio, because my audience most often is going to want to hear it. It's a more natural fit. Just anyway, go.
Oh, so folks, I did an audiobook version of Batman that I narrated, so I can actually tell you stories as you fall asleep at night. And May 1st is going to be the pub date for the audiobook version of The Boy Who Loved Batman. So you'll have both volumes where I try my best to duplicate Gene Shepherd in A Christmas Story, which was a lot of fun. But so I tell a story on my first time in Los Angeles. and I'm on my job interviews, and I managed to arrange back-to-back job interviews at CBS in Television City. So I drive in, they have me park, and I get out. I'm wearing a three-piece suit with an attaché case. I go through the parking lot, up the big stairs, down the hallway, to this wonderful receptionist who could have been a waitress at a New York City diner for sure. And she, a very tough lady. And the guy, I was meeting the vice president of legal at CBS for a job. He kept me waiting though for more than a half an hour. And then finally I get up there, I do the interview, and I realize in 5 minutes, I'm supposed to be at programming at CBS to do my other job interview. So I get down the elevator, I race past the receptionist, down that hallway, race down the steps, get into my rented Ford Pinto, which was the size of my cell phone. And in the back seat, I get out of my three-piece suit and I put on jeans and sneakers and a t-shirt and my Spielberg cap. And I go running back across the parking lot, up the stairs, down the hall, out of breath, to the receptionist and go, here for my interview with head of programming. And she looks at me and she goes, you got balls, kid.
It's the same one.
Yeah. It was the same.
Oh, beautiful.
But that's what life was like. You know, you did the best you could with what you had to work with.
You had moxie.
Yeah. That was the whole process. There's another story I tell about, this was my first interview. Oh my God. I'll have to back up a little bit, Eric, and I'm sorry I'm going off on tangents on you. But I'm a writer by trade. That's how I see myself. And when I was in school, one of the hit TV series was All in the Family. And I wrote a spec script for All in the Family. And I was told nobody will look at it unless you have an agent. And then I was told you can't get an agent unless you've already been published or have something, or they won't read your stuff. So I was on a merry-go-round for like 2.5 years trying to get representation. Finally, I got an agent who was friendly with Norman Lear, who was the producer of All in the Family. And he said, I'll read your script. He read it. He goes, I love it. He goes, I'm going to send this on to Norman. So I'm at school in Indiana. And after X number of weeks, he calls me. He goes, I just got a call and a letter from Hal Cantor, the head writer, the showrunner, the executive producer of the show. And he read me the letter. He says, this script is obviously the work of a talented professional. And it was like, oh my God, I'm a talented professional. I'm a talented professional. And he said, when he comes out to Hollywood, have him look me up about a job writing. And I go, oh my God, to write for All in the Family or one of Norman Lear's series would be amazing. So I called up Hal Cantor's secretary, told her who I was, and I said I wanted to make an appointment to see him. She goes, well, he can see you week after next. I go, no, I'm still in school, but I'll be there in 3 months. So she said, well, why don't you call me later? I said, no, I want to make sure I have this appointment. So the lady must, she said, all right, Michael. She goes, you have an appointment on December 20th. I said, that's great. So I have Christmas break and I fly to LA to do my first ever interviews that I had set up. I have no idea, Eric, that you're supposed to confirm appointments, like the day before. I didn't know how it worked.
Sure.
So I'm all dressed up. I go driving to a real movie studio. Wow, TV studio. And the security guy says, I don't have you on my list for today. I said, I have an appointment with Hal Cantor. He goes, with Hal Cantor? I go, yeah. He goes, pull your car over to the side. And I'm sitting there for like 15 minutes. And then he comes over, he goes, listen, park your car, go in, and the secretary is going to come down and talk to you. And I go in and I'm sitting there for like another half hour. And this woman comes down and she looks at me. She goes, Mr. Uslan, she goes, I'm really sorry, but Hal Cantor doesn't work here anymore. I go, what? She goes, people change their jobs very often here in this industry in Hollywood. And I said, yeah, but he told me that, you know, there could be a job for me writing when I came out. She goes, yeah, I know. And he's not here. I said, well, I made all these plans to come out here and blah, blah, blah. He said I was a talented professional. So she must have just seen this absolutely pathetic figure and said, all right, listen, let me go talk to the man who's replaced him. Just sit here. So about another 30 plus minutes go by. She comes back down. She goes, all right, the man who has taken over his job will see you for 5 minutes. And I said, okay. So I go up, and it's this guy. He was probably well into his 60s at the time, and gruff Brooklyn guy. And I go in.
I'm gonna guess. Is this Benjamin Melniker?
No.
Oh, no. Okay, go on then.
Ben would become my Batman partner. Ben was the executive vice president of MGM. All divisions reported to Ben. Now this was Milt Josephsberg. And he said to me, so what can I do for you? I said, well, I explained the situation, and Mr. Cantor said that there could be a job for me. And he said, well, why don't you just move to LA and you'll see what happens. I said, well, I actually, to be honest, I have no money, but I will find enough money to move to LA as soon as I get out of school. I plan on getting married. And it's really important that I know I will have a job to come to, that there will be, you know, money coming in. And he looks at me and he said, do you expect me to make this easy for you? He said, what the hell do you think this is? I go, excuse me? He goes, I spent my lifetime. I worked for Jack Benny. I wrote for Bob Hope. I wrote for Duffy's Tavern. He goes, the last thing I need to see is a young guy like you coming up to steal my job. And I said, sir, I don't want your job. All I want to do is write. And he said, well, don't expect me to make it easy for you. He said, you move to Los Angeles, you see what happens, and that's the way it is. Meeting over. That was my first interview in the real world. Now let's skip ahead 40 years. My aunt and uncle lived out in LA and passed away. And one Sunday I thought I would take some roses up. I found out what cemetery they were at, and leave some roses on their grave. And I went up, and all the graves were plaques. So I had to look down and keep wandering and searching for them. And I finally found my aunt and uncle. And as I bend down to do it, I realized my right foot is on a plaque. So I quickly take it off, and I look down, and it's Milt Josephsberg.
Wow.
And that was a wow moment for me. And I remember I took one of the roses and I put it down on his grave. And I said, I really didn't want your job.
It's weird. It sounds like he almost did you a favor, though, in a way. I don't know. Maybe, you know.
Yeah, it was a slap in the face.
A little bit. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I was getting a lot of slaps in the face, Eric, because there was nobody in front of me. There was nobody who counseled me, who told me I could do this, told me how to do it, told me if I was right or wrong on the until I got this first mentor of mine, Erwin Moss, who was so kind to me and for reasons I couldn't quite even figure out. And he was like head of business affairs at ICM, International Creative Management. And he was making calls for me and giving me advice. I would come into his office. He would say, you're hyperventilating. He said, take a deep breath, sit back. Why so serious? It was all of that. And if you read Batman's Batman, my new book, it opens with my encounter with Erwin. And these people, mentors, could be life-changing for you. But sure. I had to find my own way. I had nobody telling me to follow this yellow brick road.
Right. Well, and okay, I guess what I'm trying to say, that it sounds cruel, but I mean, it's obviously a dog-eat-dog business. There's probably, well, I say everybody says there's more failures than there are successes.
Yeah.
Even in your career. I mean, Batman was almost agonizing reading a couple of chapters of that, where you're just like, yep, had this project lined up, got approved, finally fought that through, go to report, they no longer work there. And they're not going to do anything with that project. And it was just over and over and over. And one of my favorite stories in there was you talked about a young lady, and you were doing the introduction story. I forgot what it was. It's been a minute for me now, but essentially it was that riveting moment in Saigon when they're handing up the baby to the helicopter, which there's actually footage of that. And by the way, it happened in Afghanistan. Really scary mirror that of throwing up the baby to the Marines. And you're asking those questions, and that I want you to tell that out, and then I've got a story to share with you, which I thought you'd get a kick out of, which is kind of similar in that.
Well, yeah, we were working on a Terry and the Pirates television series, and it was based on the contemporary version of Terry and the Pirates that I was writing as a daily syndicated comic strip through Tribune. And incredibly, the brothers Hildebrand were drawing, which was absolutely amazing. And we had this great new origin of, I think, one of the two greatest villainesses in the history of comics. There would be no Catwoman if there had not already been in Terry and the Pirates, the Dragon Lady. Mm. And this was an origin story. And in the origin story, it took place at the end of the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon. And there's tons of footage on this. This was huge. The Viet Cong were overwhelming the city, and the people were fleeing to the U.S. Embassy for asylum to get out. And there was one helicopter after another of Marines airlifting people out, and people were at the fence and literally being crushed to death at the fence of the American Embassy. And my story was about the last chopper that left the roof of the embassy, and you had this Vietnamese couple with their little daughter, and they're holding her up, and they, literally as they're being crushed to death, putting her into the hands of a U.S. Marine who takes her on that last chopper that leaves the roof of the embassy. And that would later turn out to be the Dragon Lady, who had trauma that affected who she was and how she led her life. And I was telling this story to the new head of programming at a certain cable network. She was my daughter's age. She was very young. She had just taken over there. And she looked like a deer caught in the headlights. And I said, "Are you not familiar with the fall of Saigon?" And she smiled at me and shook her head. I said, "Have you never seen the footage of the choppers leaving and the people being crushed?" And she shook her head and smiled. And I said, "Have you ever heard of the Vietnam War?" And with that, she smiled at me and said, "I don't read newspapers." That became my traumatic moment, where I said, "Oh my God, I am too old for this business now. This business has just passed me by. This is not what I knew. This is not my generation. This is not where I want to be. This is not the circumstances." Took me a while to recover from that one, but that was it.
I was sharing that with my partner Mark, and because he told me, it reminded me of his story. He's told me a few times, but he was pitching a movie, National Archives, at Universal, and he's cool. I could say the name, but I'm not going to say who it was. But anyway, he's pitching it to somebody at Universal, whoever the high up was, and he was talking about the story and everything. And the guy looks at him and he goes, "What's this National Archives?" He's like, "This is part of the government where they store all the records and documentation." I think, why haven't I heard of it? So
you read my Universal story where I wanted to do the remake of Charade, the Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn movie. And the executive I talked to there wasn't familiar with the movie. I said,
"It wouldn't be Joe Singer, would it?"
No. But I said to him, it stars Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn. And again, it's that look of the deer caught in the headlights. I go, are you familiar with Audrey Hepburn? And he looks at me and said, is she the actress whose head shakes? I go,
Catherine.
I go, no, that was Katharine Hepburn, and only like at age 90. But to be in an important position at a major studio and not at that time know the difference between Audrey Hepburn and Katharine Hepburn. Had no idea that George Kennedy hadn't spent his life as an old comedian and was actually one of the greatest heavies in cinema history. No idea that this movie Charade existed. I said, you are familiar with Cary Grant? He says, oh, yes. I've seen many of her movies.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting late on it. So I did want to ask you some specific questions, which I just find really fascinating. And
yeah, sure.
One of them is, what is a pitch versus a story?
Okay, fair question. A pitch is the solar system, and the story is the sun. The pitch is it's a meeting that takes place, which these days could be in person or by Zoom. The pitch includes your choice of what company you are going to talk to about this, where you have to strategize it. Are you talking about feature film only? Are you talking about streaming, television, animation, live action? What are the best places for it? That's part of what goes into your preparation for the pitch. What executive do you want to pitch to? Who do you know would be receptive to the kind of project that you are going to tell them about? Then you go into the pitch meeting. And the first 5 to 10 minutes is what we call the schmooze. That's when everybody gets offered water or coffee, and you sit around and you've got 5 minutes to figure out some sort of common bond between you and the potential buyers, the other people in the room. And you look for ways where you can relate to them and find common ground. Breaking the ice. That's part of the pitch process. For the pitch, you want to make sure you go in, and if you're doing it by yourself or if you're doing it with partners. If you're doing it with partners, you want to make sure everyone knows their part in the pitch. If somebody is going to be doing the storytelling, if somebody's going to do first the setup, if it's necessary to explain to people people's resumes or bios who are in the room or who are involved, or the packaging that you have involved for it, then you're going to need somebody to talk about the marketing implications at the end. Oh, this could be a branded franchise. This could have sequels. This could be a spin-off to animation. This has merchandising capability. This can work in foreign countries from China on down. So you break that up. That's part of the planning of the pitch. Once inside the pitch meeting, then it's all about storytelling and passion. Passion is 50% of it at least. And you've got to be enthusiastic and be able to communicate that enthusiasm and let that passion emanate and rub off on everyone else. And then you've got to be able to tell a story, and you have to be able to tell a story to people with inherent short attention spans. You have to be prepared to be interrupted with questions or pauses if they get a business call that they say they have to take in the middle of your storytelling, in the middle of the pitch meeting. You have to be prepared to get back on track, and you have to take the temperature constantly of the people you are pitching to in that room. And if you see you're losing somebody, they're glancing at their watch, they're distracted, then you've got to lean in and you've got to pull them back into it. Visuals. Some people will have what we call a sizzle reel. Others will have a PowerPoint. Others will have visuals. I like to walk in, maybe with a comic book, and you pick up one issue of the Hulk, and they get it. Oh, scientist gets mad, turns green, big guy. We get it. You try doing that with Constantine, Hellblazer. You'd need 68 different issues because it's such a convoluted, complex thing that on that pitch, I had to break it down. And my opening line to make them understand what they were about to hear was, "This is the James Dean of the occult world." And they responded to that. That was my setup. And then that began the storytelling that Kevin Broadbent and I did in 3 acts, scene by scene, to take them through, because this was not the Hulk. And this was something that had to be laid out carefully and explained to them. Same thing when we went to bring Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego to the big screen. Had to lay out every aspect of how you translate that and make a linear story out of it and where the character arc is. So it varies from one to the other. But so the pitch is all of that stuff. And then the storytelling and passion, that's the heart and soul. That's the sun around which everything revolves.
Now, Mark has told me that it's rare to find a writer who is also good at pitching. Correct. Is that something you found? Because he said that, like, he's gone in with Oliver before, and Oliver will just say, "All right, hey, everybody, this is Mark. Go and tell him, Mark."
Exactly right.
And then Mark's, doing the tap dance and everything else.
We just had a situation with an Oscar-winning director, and he said, "Hey, this is my vision. I love this. I'm passionate about this." And then we took it from there. I had one nightmarish experience where I had a very well-known actor who wanted to direct and write and star in his own film. And he had never pitched before. And I tried to school him. I said, "Okay, I'll come in as your producer. Well, let's try this. But you've got to do the pitching. This is entirely your vision, especially if you're coming in to do all 3 of these roles." I said, "Now remember, it's very informal, and here's how you do it." And he said, "I'll prepare my script." I said, "No script. He goes, but I always have a script." I said, no. You got to speak from your heart. This is about storytelling, and you can have visuals that can help cue your storytelling as you're telling it and keep you going in a linear way so you don't lose your place. That's fine. But this has got to come from your heart and soul. Fine. So the day comes, his first pitch, I called up some very high-level friends of mine, so I knew it would be a friendly environment going in for him. And he shows up in a 3-piece suit. Okay. I said, "You can take your jacket off." He goes, No, I'm fine. And we're doing the schmooze. Schmooze is fine. I go and I do the intro, and I said, "And now he is going to tell you his vision and the story here." And with that, he stands up, and out comes a yellow pad, and he starts reading from the yellow pad. And
oh my,
it's like this.
Oh my.
He is as nervous could be. He's trying to read it and then look up like he's giving a book report in 8th grade. And then he's sweating and sweating. It's like that scene, was it Anchorman? What was the movie? Broadcast News, where the guy just starts sweating. Is it Albert Brooks, maybe? I forget exactly. And it's like Niagara Falls got turned on. And it's dripping down his pad. And then all of a sudden, it starts coming through his suit jacket. Oh my God. It was just an unmitigated disaster. But so that's the worst. That's the worst of it.
Wow. And, I keep comparing, but I'm guessing you have to prep for that for literally like a month or 2 sometimes, right? To where you can, the story, every direction, sideways, up and down. I mean, he's told me things like, he'll be sitting there in the middle of the pitch and they'll say, well, why aren't there any Asians in there? Yeah, now there is. And and it's just like almost like a battle. It sounds like, and not in a bad way, but in a having to know every element of, is that what you found? You have to know the story so well inside out. Otherwise that you could answer any question, any direction and change
Absolutely.
on the fly.
It's like when I used to go into a history exam. Back then in my youth, I had like a photographic memory. I could read a history book the night before a test and like memorize all the book, and then go into test, spew it all back, get an A automatically. I don't have that ability anymore, I'm sorry to say. But Constantine pitch took us 6 months. 6 months. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? 6 months. And when I went in to pitch the greatest production exec I have ever had a pitch meeting with, Chris Meledandri at 20th Century Fox. Chris went on to become the producer of Minions, Despicable Me, Ice Age, all those great Fox animated features. And Chris was the most well-prepared exec and most literate I ever dealt with. And I started my pitch and he leaned into me and he stopped me at every point. He had plot points, subplot point, character issues, tonal issues. And we were going at it. We were leaning into it. It was over a 1 hour pitch. I mean, normally you think a pitch will last maybe 20 minutes typically. We were at it for over an hour. And I think I literally soaked through my shirt on that one. But I felt like I had just gone 10 rounds with Muhammad Ali. I walked out of here. I said to Ben, that was awesome. That was the greatest pitch I ever had because I had an answer for absolutely everything he tossed out. And then they made us an offer on a deal for it. It took me 6 months to work up the right pitch for Monopoly, the movie. I bought the rights to the board game from Parker Brothers and came up with a whole concept as how to change it into a linear story with characters emanating out of the board game. It would be kind of like today, a little bit of Wizard of Oz meets Jumanji, all set in Atlantic City. I had this thing nailed, but it took 6 months of hard work. And we go in for the first pitch, and I pitched it to Brandon Tartikoff, who was at that time the head
Cheers
of
and everything, right?
He was the major domo of NBC, and Paramount wanted him to come over and be the president of movies and TV over there. And in order for NBC to keep him, they agreed to start a small line of feature films at NBC. So I was going over there to pitch him for his new NBC features. And we schmooze, and he says, Michael, I loved your Batman movie. What have you brought me today? I said, Brandon, get ready. Monopoly, the movie. He goes, oh my God, I love it. I love it. Let's do it. Go make the deal with Business Affairs right now and let's do it. I go, wait a minute. You haven't heard the pitch. He goes, don't need to hear the pitch. This is the greatest thing. We're going to do it. Let's just go make the deal. I said, well, wait a minute.
Well, I put all this homework in.
It's really great to tell you. It's a great story. He goes, don't need. And then Ben's kicking me. It was like my partner, Ben, is going, shut up. We got a deal offered. Just contain yourself. I felt cheated, but we did get the deal.
You like history, right? This reminds me of something. Okay. Did you know about Monopoly and World War II and British intelligence?
I don't think I did.
Well, British intelligence, for whatever reason, they actually allowed board games into concentration camps and POW camps in Germany. And the British manufactured boards where they had a like silk screen map underneath the game board and tools for escape that they were sending in with the Monopoly games. I didn't know if you had ever heard that. It's really fascinating.
I heard that.
You should look it up. And that, by the way, could be a movie too. But anyway, okay, I've got one last question. I'll let you go. You've been really wonderful about it, but it's a rare opportunity to get to this information.
Sure.
And this might be a really short thing. I don't know, but I always hear things like, I wrote a treatment. There's the show Bible. Obviously there's screenplay. What are these terms? What do they mean? What is a treatment versus a Bible, for example?
Okay. Fair enough. A treatment I have seen as short as a page and a half. I have seen a treatment as long as 70 pages. A treatment is the basic breakdown of the story.
Is it outline kind of?
It's less than an outline. It's usually
Okay.
less than an outline. Usually, it's a summary of the 3 acts of the story you're going to tell, and it's
Mm.
brief and to the point. Sometimes it's longer because there are companies that are going to want more detail. They're going to really want to understand this better. So you do 5 pages or you do 10 pages. And a lot of treatments I've seen have been between 5 and 10 pages. That's probably the majority of the ones that I've ever seen. The 70-page one, I remember, it would have taken about 2 weeks to turn into a feature film script. That there was so much work and detail that had been put into that. That's very rare. But that's step one. So before you let anyone start writing a screenplay, people want to know, well, what's the story and who are the main characters here? We want to get a real concrete grasp of that before we start spending the money on writing the official screenplay. A Bible is typically used in television, both in animation and live action. And that will have, here's the concept of the show. Here is year 1 of the series. Here are the major plots, the major characters. Here are the subplots, the sub-characters. Here's where we're going to go in season 2, in season 3, in season 4. And that becomes the Bible of the TV series that really allow, and when I say TV these days, it incorporates streaming. That really allows people to get a sense of where this, if they invest in it and they want to make this thing happen, where it goes, and if they see black flags, that they can flag it and make some changes before things get going. They want to, of course, in television and streaming, the writer is the most important element to the whole thing. That's why showrunners now are getting paid by some of these streaming services upwards of $100 million contracts, because it's all about the head writer and the head writer's vision, and the head writer putting together and running a writer's room. And it's important that every writer have the Bible and know what's going on. Same thing in animation. In movies, it's really about the director, and the director is filmmaker, and the director's vision going forward. And that's a big difference between the two.
Interesting. Ziggy Shrugs from the chat said, is it like establishing the canon?
Is what?
It's like establishing the canon?
Yeah, I think you could say that. Sure.
Okay. And is there any other term, they seem related to me, treatment of the Bible. Is there another term I haven't heard of that would fit in that mix?
There's a set of revisions of a screenplay where you get a draft, and then everybody has a period of time to talk about it. And then collectively you hand the writer the notes, and then a revised draft is made. So in terms of the Guild, typically you talk about 8 weeks for a first draft, 2 weeks to do a set of revisions, 4 weeks for a second draft, 2 weeks to do a second set of revisions. That's like a typical situation. Okay. Not that every situation is typical.
All right. Well, perfect. Thank you so much. Now, is there any question that I should have asked you that I neglected to?
Yeah. So Michael, I hear that you're working on a Broadway play.
So Michael,
what is that?
Tell us about it.
Thanks for asking. At this stage of my career, I've been at this 45 years, Eric. I'm in the 4th quarter of my career, and I know that. Most of my friends and cousins my age have retired, and they've been looking forward to this for the last 20 years. I love what I do.
You're dreading it. They look forward to it.
I love what I do, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge to stay relevant, because everything's changing at a revolutionary pace. Almost every day, our industry is changing. The tech is changing. You look at NFTs, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, AR, VR. Everything is changing so fast in this world. And if you don't push yourself out of your comfort zone, you're doomed. You're doomed to irrelevancy faster than you could ever imagine. I'm lucky I have two kids, one of which, my son David, is my partner in my producing stuff, and my daughter Sarah, who is one of the leading makeup artists in Hollywood and has her own line of skincare products now called Lula, Lula. And she was just at the Oscars. Her client is Olivia Colman, the great actress. So Sarah was backstage about 25 feet away from
the slap.
But we don't talk about that. So I was approached by the Nederlander Organization of New York City. The Nederlanders and the Schuberts are Broadway, period, end of story. And the Nederlanders said they realized that coming out of COVID, there was going to be a new normal for Broadway, and that they were looking for plays that would be inspirational, that would talk about people who dream big, but then persevere against all obstacles and challenges to finally succeed. They wanted it to be entertaining and uplifting. And they said, we read your book, The Boy Who Loved Batman, and the sequel, Batman's Batman, and we want to do a play based on your story. So that is now in the works. It's being fast-tracked for Broadway.
Wow.
We just hired the director, our first choice. We hope that it will, if everything goes according to the Broadway gods, that by spring of 2023, this will be on Broadway. And it's The Boy Who Loved Batman.
That's really awesome, man. That's
really
my awesome.
God. Very exciting and very different from anything I've done in my entire career.
Yeah, but then that's kind of the fun part. You know, I mean,
it is.
And I could go on all day. Seriously, folks. I mean, I have other notes, but I really enjoy talking to you. Everybody do check out his book, Batman's Batman. I listened to it. If you had the other one on audio, I would have listened to that, but
May 1st.
May 1st. So, everybody check this out. It is available on Amazon, pretty much everywhere. And Michael, thank you so much.
You're welcome. We got a movie that's still out in movie theaters called The Batman that I love what the genius of Matt Reeves has done with the perfect cast. It's for those of you who are like me, you know, real Batman fans, and understand that he was the world's greatest detective, and understand the trauma that young Bruce Wayne went through, and understand that he didn't just overnight put on a mask and become the Dark Knight. It was an evolution that takes time and growth. And it just, to me, it has been an absolutely fascinating, wonderful experience. And I urge you all to see it while it is still on the big screen in the theaters before it heads to streaming.
Great. There you go. Everybody can chew on that while waiting for your audiobook.
Good enough.